Patrick Moore, and John Eichert.
Good morning. I'm Rick Parker. I'm from the College of Southern Idaho. There's no good way to get there from here or here from there, but I'm glad to be here. As I walked up here, I asked Vicki, she called me the moderator. I've been called a facilitator too, so I'm not sure which I am, but all I want to know is, do I have to stay up here while they do their presentation? And she says, no, I can sit in the audience, so I'm glad for that. As a facilitator, I figured the best thing I could do is just sit down and get out of the way and let these two men have what they have to say given to you, because they have some great ideas that you all need to hear. And I would tell you that in the book that you received when you registered, the biographies of all these people are in there, and you should read those. But just kind of a short little biography of these two people. I met Dr. Moore in Iowa at a conference there, and I heard that he'd been 7 years the director of Greenpeace, and that was in the bio that I read when I was there, and I thought, well, that's one I don't need to go to. But I did go, and I have to admit, it was well worth my time, and it will be well worth your time. He is now the founder and director of Green Spirit, and he's been 30 years in international environmental issues, or environmental field. Dr. Moore received his PhD from University of British Columbia, and he is focused basically on sustainability and building consensus among competing issues. Dr. John Eichert is currently retired professor emeritus, where he spends time writing and speaking about sustainability and economic issues. So he was at one time the coordinator for the Sustainable Ag at University of Missouri, and he conducted a 5-year, 3-state project there that was funded by the Kellogg Foundation, looking at the economics of sustainability and also looking at community development and sustainability. So with that, Dr. Moore, it's all yours, and then we'll just follow with Dr. Eichert. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you this morning on systems and sustainability, but actually the title of my presentation is Environmentalism for the 21st Century. I'll try this morning to connect some dots. Too often I think environmental issues are framed as single issues: save the forests, save the whales, stop GM, ZPG, whatever. But these issues are all interrelated, of course. Populations related to energy, and energy is related to agriculture, and agriculture is related to biodiversity, and biodiversity is related to forests. So I'm going to try and show you my thoughts about how things are all connected. But first, let me give you a little background about myself. greenspirit.com is my website. You don't need to take notes. Everything here is on that website, along with a lot of other stuff. I was lucky to be born and raised in the tiny fishing and logging village of Winter Harbor on the northwest tip of Vancouver Island in the rainforest by the Pacific. I didn't realize how lucky I was growing up playing on the tide flats by the salmon spawning streams in the rainforest until I was shipped off to boarding school in Vancouver at age 14, where I soon learned city ways, ending up eventually at the University of BC studying the life sciences: biology, biochemistry, genetics, some forestry. Then I discovered ecology, the science of how all living things are interrelated and how we are related to them. I became a born-again ecologist, and in the late 1960s was soon transformed into a radical environmental activist. I can't seem to get it to go that way anymore. I found myself in a church basement in Vancouver with a like-minded group of activists planning a protest voyage against US hydrogen bomb testing in Alaska. That's me under the P in 1971. We proved that a small group could sail a leaky old boat across the North Pacific, focus media attention on the nuclear tests, and help change history. When that H-bomb was detonated in November '71 at Amchitka Island in the Aleutians, it was the last hydrogen bomb ever exploded on Earth. There were more atomic tests after that, but President Nixon canceled the remaining hydrogen bomb tests in the series due to overwhelming public opposition. At the height of the Cold War and the height of the Vietnam War, in retrospect, this was a major turning point in the global arms race. Flushed with victory, realizing a few people could get something done by just getting up out of their chairs, We were welcomed on our way home from Alaska into the longhouse of the Quagouth Nation at Alert Bay near my northern Vancouver Island home, where we were made brothers of the tribe. For Greenpeace, this began the tradition of the Warriors of the Rainbow. It's after a Cree legend that says one day when the skies are black and the birds fall dead and the waters are poisoned, that people around the world will join together to save the environment. We named our ship Rainbow Warrior, and I spent the next 15 years full-time on the front lines of the environmental movement around the world. Next, we took on French atmospheric nuclear testing in the South Pacific. France was still detonating A-bombs in the air, sending radiation around the world. They were a little tougher. It took years to drive French nuclear testing underground. In 1985, French commandos bombed and sank the Rainbow Warrior in Auckland Harbor, killing our photographer. But the campaign continued long after I left Greenpeace until the mid-90s, when French nuclear testing was finally ended in the South Pacific as well as in most other parts of the world. This is me driving a rubber inflatable into the first encounter with a Soviet factory whaling fleet in the North Pacific in 1975. We confronted the whalers, putting ourselves in front of their harpoons in our little rubber boats, and to protect the fleeing whales. This got us on television around the world, bringing the Save the Whales movement into everyone's living room for the first time. Only 4 years later, factory whaling was banned in the North Pacific and eventually in all the world's oceans. Here I am sitting on a baby seal in 1978 to protect it from the Hunters Club. I was taken to jail, the seal was clubbed and skinned, but this picture appeared in over 3,000 newspapers around the world the next morning. This and many other direct actions eventually brought an end to the annual slaughter of hundreds of thousands of nursing seal pups in their breeding grounds off eastern Canada. Anyways, by the mid-80s, we'd grown from the church basement to a group with $100 million a year coming in and offices in 21 countries. Presidents and prime ministers were talking about the environment every day, whereas when we'd started, it was just a fringe group. And more importantly, a majority of people, especially in the Western democracies, were in favor of the environment and agreed with what we were doing. I felt our job of bringing about awareness in the public was more or less complete. For me, it was time to make a change. I had been against at least 3 or 4 things every day of my life for 15 years. I decided I'd like to be in favor of something for a change. I made the transition from the politics of confrontation, telling people what to stop doing, to the politics of trying to find consensus about what we should do instead. Because after all, there's no getting away from the fact that 6 billion plus people wake up every morning on this planet with real need for food, energy, and materials. Sustainability, which I believe is the next logical step after environmental activism, is about continuing to provide those needs, maybe getting more stuff for the people in the developing countries, while at the same time reducing our negative environmental impact. It's not always easy to balance environmental, social, and economic priorities. But what other logical approach is there to a situation where we have to maintain our civilization while at the same time maintaining the environment upon which it ultimately depends for its survival? Not all my fellow environmentalists saw things that way. I just used my house up on the north end of Vancouver Island, where we spend our summers now, as a backdrop to this next presentation. A lot of environmentalists drifted into environmental extremism. There were 2 reasons why environmental extremism arose in the mid-80s. First, because a majority of people accepted all our reasonable positions, the only way to remain adversarial and confrontational was to adopt ever more extreme ones, eventually drifting away from science and logic altogether into zero-tolerance agendas. Secondly, the Berlin Wall came down, and a lot of people in the peace movement, which was basically pretty ultra-leftist and anti-capitalist, moved into the environmental movement, bringing their pro-Sandinista and neo-Marxist rhetoric with them. In other words, at that time, much of the environmental movement was hijacked by political and social activists who used green rhetoric to cloak agendas that had more to do with anti-globalization than anything to do with science or technology. Not that political and social activism isn't a legitimate field, but it's confusing to the public when they use green rhetoric, in other words, make it appear as though they're environmental issues, when in fact they are largely political. You can spot environmental extremism in any crowd. First, environmental extremists tend to be anti-human. Human beings are depicted as a cancer on the earth. Second, anti-science and anti-technology. You don't have to go any further than the anti-GM campaign to see that. Third, anti-trade and anti-globalization. How much sense does it make for people who use laptops, cell phones, and jet planes as their main tools of the trade to be anti-globalization? I saw a guy in a demonstration had a sign on that said, "Join the worldwide struggle against globalization." Doesn't make any sense at all to me. They're basically anti-business. Profits are perceived as bad. Capitalism is wrong. And yet no alternative institutional framework is offered to provide the goods and services required by the 6 billion people on the planet. And basically, environmental extremism is anti-civilization. There's this naive vision of going back to some kind of Garden of Eden, when in fact 100 years ago, people only lived to be 35 and there weren't enough doctors and dentists to go around. So I don't really go along with this agenda, but it's amazing, especially with media attention, how many people have been brought into thinking this way. Let me give you some examples of where people get confused about environmental issues. We all think there's something wrong with exotic species, alien species, foreign species. Words that are generally thought of as somewhat racist when used in relation to people are used in relation to other species as if there's something fundamentally wrong with them. It's interesting to note that California, which is the breadbasket of the United States, did not produce one single agricultural plant or animal. Every single crop that is grown in California is an exotic or alien species. In other words, exotic species are the very foundation of our agriculture. When wheat is grown in the United States, it is an alien invasive species. Look at how much area it has taken up, with our assistance, mind you. When corn is grown in Eurasia, it is an exotic species. Now it's true there's some exotic species that we don't like because they cause disease and pestilence and eat our crops and take over from other plants that we'd rather have growing there. But that's true all around the world. Not only that, there's many native species that we don't like either. The reason we dislike certain species has nothing to do with whether they're exotic or native. The invisible poisons that will kill us all in our sleep. The environmental movement has been very clever at inventing scare campaigns that make us think there's things in our food that are going to hurt us. Pesticides is the classic case, beginning way back with the anti-pesticide campaigns, some of which were legitimate in terms of individual compounds. But in general, the concern is about pesticide residues in food causing cancer in humans. In the 90s, the National Cancer Research Institutes of Canada and the US joined in a multi-year study to look at the relationship between pesticide residues in food and cancer in humans. In 1997, September, in the journal Cancer, they published their findings. They could not find one single piece of evidence anywhere that pesticide residues in food have caused cancer in humans. And yet they pointed out that it is known that 30% of cancer in humans is caused by tobacco consumption, a perfectly natural substance. And another 35% is caused by bad diet, mainly too much fat and cholesterol, also perfectly natural substances. But most importantly, they pointed out that the campaign against pesticides is causing parents to avoid fresh fruit and vegetables for themselves and their children. What's the main preventative for cancer? Fresh fruit and vegetables in our diet. Therefore, the campaign against pesticides is actually causing cancer in people by reducing the amount of fresh fruit and vegetables they consume. Of course, today, the classic one is GM, genetically modified food crops. Frankenstein foods, killer tomatoes, Terminator seeds. Very effective metaphors to scare people into being afraid of genetically modified foods. Is it any coincidence that every single one of those metaphors is borrowed from a scary Hollywood movie? Terminator, Revenge of the Killer Tomatoes, and Frankenstein? The campaign against GM is based as much on fantasy as those three movies are. But it's very effective in propaganda when you associate scary words and nasty concepts with what are otherwise objective descriptors, such as genetically modified. Not exactly a scary term in itself. Greenpeace, the World Wildlife Fund, the Sierra Club, and most of the other large activist environmental groups have a policy of zero tolerance towards GM crops. Their position is that 0 genetically modified organisms should be released into the environment and otherwise used. They're even against golden rice. because their position is zero tolerance. It is an ideological position. I met Ingo Potrykus and have become friends with him, the Swiss co-inventor of golden rice. Him and his colleague, with state funds, no multinationals involved, took a gene from daffodils, the gene that makes daffodils colored, that's carotene in the daffodil, put it into a rice plant and produced a rice plant that has beta-carotene in it, the precursor to vitamin A. Rice does not contain any carotene. 500,000 children go blind in Asia and Africa every year due to vitamin A deficiency because of excessive dependence on rice. Ingo figured out how to put vitamin A in the rice. The Rice Research Institute in the Philippines has perfected it. It's ready to go. They've cleared away all the intellectual property, and any farmer who makes 10,000 US or less in the developing world is free to use this with no royalty. Ingo tells me it will be 5 years minimum before the regulatory hurdles can be overcome to allow the first planting of golden rice. 2.5 million more kids have to go blind because of these stupidly excessive regulations preventing a rice plant with a daffodil gene from being grown in the ground. No risk has been identified from this rice plant with a daffodil gene in it. And yet the risk of not planting it is absolutely certainly 2.5 million more kids will go blind, and hundreds of millions of more will suffer the chronic impact of vitamin A deficiency. Ingo has now created a rice plant with vitamin A, vitamin E, iron, which is the largest nutritional deficiency in the developing world, especially in women, and enhanced amino acid, increased lysine. Basically a vitamin pill in a grain of rice. Under the present regulatory regime, that will never be allowed to be used in the history of the world, no matter what anyone does. That is how ridiculous the campaign against GM has become. When it is a known fact that the 150 million acres of GM crops that are in the ground now have resulted in a vast reduction in chemical pesticide application and therefore an increase in the non-target species of insects in particular that live on the farm and are not a nuisance and are now allowed to survive and feed birds, etc. A huge reduction in soil erosion from no and zero-till agricultural practices which are made possible to some extent by GM technology, and an increase in productivity, higher yield. Cotton farmers in Indonesia are getting 4 times the yield when they get rid of the bollworm. People who are living in poverty are able to afford housing and education for their families for the first time. The same thing is happening in China and in India and now in the Philippines. And thankfully, I was just down in Puerto Alegre a month ago to speak to the Farmers Union and encourage them to defy the ban on GM soy in southern Brazil. And I see that today, against all odds, the Brazilian government has finally agreed to allow GM soy to be grown in southern Brazil. Of course, they were growing it already, but it was being done in a black market way. Now they're going to be legal. Anyways, I could talk forever about GM and the invisible poisons that are going to kill us in our sleep, but it's all a scare campaign, and it's raising billions of dollars around the world for something in which we are stopping science from moving forward. I'd like to remind people it was only 40 years ago that Khrushchev, having succeeded Stalin, finally fired Lysenko, the agriculture minister of Russia, who had ruled for 30 years and sent hundreds of Russian scientists to jail to die, including the top geneticists of Russia. That was kind of an intellectual dark ages over the whole of the Soviet Union. Will the molecular biologists and geneticists working on GM today be condemned to an intellectual gulag with Greenpeace as their prison guards? We shall see. The dark age is always just around the corner unless we guard against it. Climate change is one of my favorite subjects. People make extreme statements on both sides. The environmentalists say a global climate apocalypse is upon us. The oil companies and the car people don't think it's a problem. They try and debunk climate change at every turn. It's really interesting to note that climate change is a classic case of the limitations of scientific prediction. We like to think that if we throw enough money at enough people in lab coats that we can get an answer to anything. That isn't true. Science has fundamental limitations. 2 of them are at work in climate change. First, there are too many variables that we can't control. When you bring something into a lab and control all the variables and then just fiddle around with the one you're interested in, it's easy to see what's going on. but we can't do that with all the variables in the global climate. Second, and most important, there's only one planet Earth. It's very hard to do statistics on a sample of one. If we had 50 planet Earths that were identical, and we left 25 alone and fooled around with the other 25's CO2 content in their atmosphere, maybe we could do some statistics and get something meaningful out of it. But because there's only one Earth, we are reduced to questionable computer models and best guesswork, in fact. The other thing about climate change is that people get confused between the economic and the environmental impacts. We're told that if the sea level rises, it will be an environmental catastrophe. To tell you the truth, the fish won't mind if the sea level rises. The people who own the docks and dikes are going to be mighty upset, though, and so are their insurance companies. Most of the negatives about climate change are economic and social, not environmental. The environment can withstand climate change. It has been doing so for billions of years. But our human civilization is very fragile in terms of crops and floods and all of the other things that can come from climate change. Now, Canada has signed the Kyoto Protocol, where I come from. I'm very happy we have, even though I don't agree with its basis in that China and Brazil and India are exempt, which I don't think makes much sense. But that's the way they worked it out. But one thing it's going to do, where countries have signed it, is drive innovation in energy efficiency and renewable energy technology, etc. So I like that side of it. The US has decided not to sign it, with good reason too, I believe, because the only way to actually stop CO2 from becoming higher in the atmosphere at this stage of the game is to reduce fossil fuel consumptions by 80% worldwide. In other words, to basically bring about an end to civilization. We simply cannot do that. That's what the US policy is based on, that it would be a destruction of the economy in order to save the world. And does that make any sense? So a lot of people think the correct approach is to mitigate, in other words, to adapt to climate change, while at the same time working on long-term programs that do bring about a reduction in reliance on fossil fuels and higher dependency on renewables. But that won't be done in 10 years. Anyways, I could talk about this for a while too, but I'll go on to my favorite subject, which is trees. There is no doubt about it. Forests are home to the majority of all living species on the earth. It's one of the reasons I enjoy the subject so much, because in fact, forests are the most complicated living system in the universe as far as we know. There's a reason why most species live in forests. The living bodies of the trees themselves create an environment that wouldn't be there otherwise. Now the canopy above is home to millions of birds, insects, and animals, where all there was thin air before the trees were there. And the interior of the forest is now protected from frost, wind, and sun. This, in combination with the food provided by the fruit and the leaves, and even the wood when the trees die, creates thousands of new habitats or homes for species to evolve into, species that could never have existed if it weren't for the presence of the living trees. This gives rise to the obvious concern that if we cut all the trees down, all those homes will be lost and those species will die. In 1996, the World Wildlife held a media conference in Geneva that was carried by Associated Press around the world to hundreds of millions of people. They said 50,000 species are going extinct every year, and the main cause is logging. Since that time, I have asked the World Wildlife Fund on many occasions to please give me a list of some of the species that have gone extinct from logging or forestry. Not one example has been offered as evidence. You would think if there was 50,000 a year and the main cause was logging, they might know the names of a couple of them. But they don't, and there's a very simple reason for that. To the best of our scientific knowledge, no species has become extinct due to forestry in North America, at least. I know of every species that's gone extinct since European colonization of North America, and none of them are attributable to logging or forestry. So where are these 50,000 species then that are going extinct every year? I looked into that too, and I know exactly where they are. They are in a computer model in Edward O. Wilson's lab at Harvard University. They're electrons on a hard drive with no Latin names and no relationship to any real species in any real forest. Yet reputable journals like National Geographic, Discover Magazine, Scientific American, New York Times, oh well, they're not so reputable anymore, and Parker-CSI all give credibility to the idea that 50,000 species are going extinct because of human activity and the main cause is forestry. yet not one can be named. Now, it's not as if we don't cause species to go extinct. We do, and we have been doing it for thousands of years, long before the Industrial Revolution. The dodo bird, the passenger pigeon, the Carolinian parakeet, the only parrot that was native to the United States in the South, and the mammoths and mastodons thousands of years ago were all either hunted into extinction or eradicated on purpose because they were pests, as was the Carolinian parakeet, a pest on farmers' crops. When it came in huge flocks, it flew around preying on the crops as they were, after they'd been harvested. The farmers came out to shoot them, and as the farmer shot them and they fell to the ground, all the rest would stay around circling in a flock until every last one was dead in a heap on the ground. Not a very good survival technique in the face of a farmer with a gun. But that's what happened, and now there's no more Carolinian parakeets. Second, the vast clearance of native ecosystems for agricultural production. There might have been a lily living in the middle of that field that didn't exist anywhere else on Earth. If you cut the forest, burn it, plow it, and plant it with pumpkins or corn or wheat, you're liable to lose the lily. And third, actually the main cause of species extinction in the last couple hundred years is the introduction of exotic predators. Here's a place where animals that came from somewhere else really did cause negative impacts. When Europeans colonized Australia, New Zealand, and all the other Pacific islands, including Hawaii, they brought with them rats, cats, and foxes in particular, but many other species of domestic animals and plants as well. Many flightless birds and ground-dwelling mammals on these islands were not able to withstand these new predators and were exterminated by them, in the 1800s mainly. We have long lists of species that have gone extinct from overhunting and eradication, agricultural clearance, habitat loss in other words, and introduced species, but not one that we know of that's gone extinct from forestry. This is why I canceled my subscription to National Geographic in February of 1999. They published an edition called Biodiversity, the Fragile Web. Well, that's nice. Inside it said, some 50% of the world's flora and fauna could be on a path to extinction within 100 years. Well, in fact, 100% of all the species of flora and fauna are on a path to extinction right now, never mind in 100 years. But they make this into be a scare story. It's everything and it's everywhere. It's a worldwide epidemic of extinction. Balderdash. There is no worldwide epidemic of extinctions. And third, the doom and gloom part, where our children might as well slit their own throats. No decision will change their fate. They are simply doomed to disappear from Earth. I can't stand that. It's not true, for one thing. This is Tim Flannery, an otherwise lovely man who runs the National Museum in Australia. He wrote a great book called The Future Eaters, which is about the colonization of Australia by humans 60,000 years ago and the extinction of all the large megafauna on that island continent at that time. And here are some of the species that went extinct when rats, cats, and foxes were brought to Australia. It was a spike of extinctions that occurred as a result of the introduction of these predators. But this is what really made me change my mind about National Geographic. They've had this graph here that shows the 6 great extinctions, beginning 600 million years ago at the Cambrian explosion when multicellular life forms first emerged. And look at the biodiversity. This is families of life, cat family, dog family, ape family, etc. Not species, but whole families. The number of families that are on the Earth at any given time. Up it goes, and then there's a couple of spikes of extinction, and then the Permian extinction 225 million years ago, almost certainly caused by a meteor, and then the Cretaceous extinction 65 million years ago, definitely caused by a meteor, where the dinosaurs went extinct. But that was the 5th extinction. Now look at, the interesting thing is that all through evolution since the Cambrian explosion, the diversity of families of living things has gone up, despite these huge events which caused them to go down on the way. Up they go, especially lately. Then there's the 6th great extinction. I wrote to National Geographic's editors and I said, why does the line turn fuzzy where it goes down there at the end? Is it because you don't actually know of any families of beetles, amphibians, birds, and large mammals that have gone extinct lately? Because of course none have. Individual species have gone extinct in the last 100 years. There's actually less species going extinct now than there were 100 years ago. But there's no families that have gone extinct. They wrote back and said, Mr. Moore, rest assured that our experts have advised us on this matter, blah, blah, blah. Did not give me an answer as to why the line turned fuzzy. so I canceled my subscription. I believe that trees are the answer to a lot of questions about our future on this planet. Questions such as, how can we move to an economy that's based more on renewable and less on non-renewable resources? How can we pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere from our excessive use of fossil fuels? And what material can we use as a substitute for those energy and materials that are causing that CO2 to go up in the atmosphere in the first place? How can we build healthy soils and maintain them? How can we have cleaner air and water? How can we provide more habitat for biodiversity and wildlife? How can we make this earth more green and beautiful? The answer to all those questions, from what we should build our house out of, very practical level, to the most aesthetic of how we can make the earth prettier, is trees. Most people think the forests of North America are disappearing because we're cutting them down for houses. The fact is, the forests of North America occupy the same area of land today as they did 100 years ago. In other words, all the net clearance for agriculture occurred before 1900, actually before the Civil War in most cases. How could this possibly be when population has tripled and we are the highest per capita users of forest products in the world? For two reasons. First, advances in agriculture, in chemistry, technology, biology, genetics, make it possible to grow 5 times as much food on the same area of land as we could just 50 years ago. The more food we grow per acre, the less forest has to be cleared away to grow it, or whatever other natural ecosystem it might be. But secondly, and most counterintuitive, it's because we use so much wood that there's still so much forest. We've been duped into thinking that when you go into a lumber yard to buy wood, you're causing a bit of forest to be lost, when in fact what you're really doing is sending a signal into the marketplace to grow more trees and produce more wood. It's the same with tomatoes. If there was a cancer scare about tomatoes, people would stop buying them and farmers wouldn't plant them the next year. But if tomatoes were shown to cure cancer, they'd be off the shelves in a week, and next year there'd be double, triple, quadruple the plantings. The trees are exactly the same. It's just that it takes a little longer for the signal to go through the system because trees take more than a year to grow. But as long as the signal is loud and clear, the demand for wood is strong, people will plant trees. 85% of all the timber produced in the U.S. is from private land. Those private landowners have a choice of what to do with their land. Nobody's legislating that they have to keep it in trees. They could easily deforest it and turn it into a wheat field or a cow pasture, but they don't. Why? Because they have calculated that the highest and best economic use of their land is to grow timber, and at the same time, therefore, provide the habitat for the turkeys and the bears and the insects and the birds. Biodiversity is always higher in forests of any kind than it is in annual farm crops. And so what a win-win for the environment it is that we use so much wood. Wood is also the most renewable and environmentally friendly of all the building materials we use to maintain our civilization, especially when it comes to housing. 60% of all the wood in the world is burned for energy. Most people don't realize that. Over a third of the world's population still depends on wood as their main source of energy. So why don't they switch to alternatives and stop cutting the trees? Well, what would the alternatives be? They'd actually end up doing the same thing we've done. Move to fossil fuels as your main source of energy. How are we going to reduce CO2 emissions from our already excessive use of fossil fuels if another 2 billion people switch from renewable to non-renewable energy sources? No way, that's how. 20% of the wood is for solid wood products to make houses and furniture, etc. All the substitutes, steel, concrete, plastic, aluminum, all require a vast amount more energy to produce, especially for building our houses. Why? Because wood is made in a factory called the forest by renewable solar energy. Wood is the material embodiment of solar power. When you burn a piece of wood in your fireplace, you are simply releasing the energy of the sun that the tree stored through photosynthesis while it was growing in the forest. Other materials have to be made in real factories with huge inputs of fossil fuels and CO2 emissions. So for 80% of the wood we use for energy and building, substitutes invariably result in higher fossil fuel consumption and higher CO2 emissions, and therefore a greater threat of the adverse impacts of climate change. This is the energy use for a structure made mainly of wood, mainly of steel, and mainly of concrete, not to maintain the structure or to heat it, but to build it. The materials that go into the construction. There's energy use. Here's greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, when you make concrete, you slake lime from calcium carbonate to lime, which reduces CO2 as well as the heat fossil fuel that goes into doing that, and so you have huge emissions of CO2 from concrete production. Growing more trees and using more wood as a substitute for non-renewable fossil fuels and materials is one of our most powerful tools for reducing CO2 emissions and the threat of climate change. I call it closing the carbon cycle. First you grow more trees and suck more carbon out of the air, then you use the wood sustainably as a substitute for steel, concrete, and fossil fuels as an energy source. All these forest fires we're having in the West is because there's too much wood in the forests. If we would thin those forests and remove the dead wood and the young trees that are causing a ladder to go up into the crowns and use it as biomass energy in huge electricity plants, we could substitute for coal and make electricity with wood and thus close the carbon cycle. But no one's connecting the dots there quite yet. A few people, but not at a high enough level. This is my declaration in support of protecting the environment by growing more trees and using more wood. It's part of the theme of intensive agriculture and silvicultural production. Again, the more food we grow per acre and the more wood we grow per acre, the more land can be left in nature and wilderness. Intensive agricultural production is the only way 6 billion people can provide for their food requirements and at the same time leave some of this earth alone. If we went back to purely organic techniques, stopped using any synthetic fertilizers or any synthetic pesticides, and said no to GM, it would take double, triple, quadruple the amount of land to produce the same amount of food as we do today. That is a fact. And as Norman Borlaug points out, just eliminating nitrogen from the Haber process from our fertilizer inputs would result in 2 billion people dying, because there is only enough organic nitrogen for 4 billion people. The only way to get more nitrogen would be to have a huge increase in cattle. Some people think we got enough of those already. So why not pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere? The idea that these synthetic fertilizers are somehow chemical fertilizer is ridiculous. For one thing, the phosphorus and the potassium are both obtained from marine deposits. Saskatchewan, north of here, has the world's largest deposits of phosphate rock. It's just a marine deposit. It's perfectly natural. It's no different than using peat moss. It's a thing that came there through perfectly natural mechanisms. It's a natural substance. The nitrogen in the air is a pretty natural substance too. We breathe it in. Every time we breathe a compound in, a mixture in that has 70% nitrogen in it. So what are we afraid of nitrogen coming from the air and making fertilizer for our food? Anyways, this subject, grow more trees and use more wood. The anti-forestry movement of the environmental movement is 180 degrees wrong. When the Winter Olympics at Lillehammer, the first Olympics that had a sustainability policy built into them, they looked at it and they said we should build the whole infrastructure out of wood because that's the most environmentally friendly material. This marked the beginning of Greenpeace's campaign against the use of wood in the Olympic movement. In the year 2000, the Sydney Green Olympics was called green, and Greenpeace made a deal with the Australian government. They said, we'll support you calling it green as long as you don't use any native Australian timbers in the construction of the games, and as long as you ban PVC in the construction of the games. So the Australian government said, okay, sure, fine, then we'll call it the Green Olympics. It ended up being all made out of steel and concrete, and most of Australians' timbers, the most renewably produced material, were banned from construction. I've been fighting this for a long time now. They tried to do, at every Olympics now, they try to get in a clause that makes it difficult to use wood in the construction of the Olympic facilities. My friend Bjorn Lomborg, the Danish scholar and statistician, not a scientist per se, because he doesn't really do research, but he is a statistician. He's 30-something. He is openly gay and a Greenpeace supporter all during his early years. Most interesting man. I've spent days with him and email back and forth to him all the time now. He published The Skeptical Environmentalist, a 500-page book, heavily annotated with statistics from UN and national sources around the world. Basically, he said, proving the case that most of the trends in human health and welfare and environment are positive today. People in the developing countries are getting more calories per capita than they did 30 years ago. Their death rate is lower. Their longevity is higher. The air and water is getting cleaner in most parts of the world because of pollution control. There's less toxic waste being dumped into the environment. Just because things are getting better doesn't mean they're good enough. But contrary to the doom and gloom theorists, things are not getting worse by and large. They are by and large getting better. Bjorn Lomborg has become the sworn enemy of the doom and gloom extreme environmental campaigns. They want to drive a stake through this guy's heart, and they've actually done a pretty good job of it so far. Scientific American, which you could expect to have a somewhat objective viewpoint, published a 16-page editorial diatribe against Bjorn Lomborg's book in January of 2002, just over a year ago, in which they did not give Bjorn Lomborg one page of rebuttal. They said, "You've had enough news already." So they attacked him in 16 pages, hired 4 ultra-green scientists to provide critiques of Bjorn Lomborg's work and of his personality. As it turned out, it was a personal attack. Bjorn took that 16-page editorial and annotated it with his own comments after every paragraph. That ended up being a 32-page diatribe. He published that on his website and said, "Here's my response to the Scientific American editorial." 2 days later, he got an email from the legal department of Scientific American threatening him with copyright violation and a lawsuit if he didn't take it down. He took it down. He didn't want to be sued by Scientific American. He was just a little statistics professor in the University of Aarhus in Denmark. I emailed Bjorn and said, "Bjorn, send me that file. I'll put it up on my website and pretend you gave it to me before they sent you the letter." So he sent it to me, I put it up on my website, put out press releases to all the major press and said, "Here it is." Very few of the press picked the story up. The press don't like to eat their own. It's very difficult to get the newspapers to be critical of Scientific American in any way, even when they are using heavy-handed legal tactics against an academic who is simply trying to engage in discussion on the most important environmental groups of the day. So I put it up and left it up, and then I got the letter, "Dear Dr. Moore," in my email. "We are prepared to settle this matter amicably." Don't lawyers write nice? If I'd take it down. But of course I didn't take it down. I responded to the senior editor of Scientific American with an email containing the section of U.S. copyright law called fair use. Fair use entitles anyone to use other people's copyrighted material without their permission for the purpose of scholarship, education, and critique. Now, if Bjorn and I had been standing outside the book stand with fake copies of Scientific American undercutting the price that it was for sale for inside, that would be copyright infringement. But it is not copyright infringement for a teacher to copy a single article out of a publication and distribute it to the class. That is fair use because it's for education. And what Bjorn was doing was fair use too, only he was intimidated by these guys. Now what is the matter with National Geographic and Scientific American and Discover magazine? I'll tell you what's the matter. They've been taken over by journalists who want to sell magazines. John Rennie, the senior editor of Scientific American, is not a scientist. He's a journalist. And this has happened to all the non-peer-reviewed popular science journals. So be careful what you read in them. To conclude, I'll take us through my 6 high-level items for environmentalism in the 21st century. What should we be focusing on in order to move ourselves into a sustainable future in the 21st century? First, and these are in no particular order of importance, renewable energy and materials. Renewability and sustainability are strongly linked. They're not identical. For example, iron ore, which is non-renewable, will last forever. There's more of it in the Earth's crust than we could ever possibly build things with. But the energy to convert that iron ore into steel is not limitless and is either renewable or non-renewable. And believe me, there's not much renewable energy being used to make steel these days. Wind power will be a huge plus on the renewable energy side because it's cost effective now. Denmark gets 15% of its electricity from wind now, and we'll get 30%. That's about the maximum because wind is intermittent and you can't depend on it for your base load. but it's there and it's reasonably inexpensive. Solar panels, which for whatever reason the environmental movement focus on so much, because I think they like to focus on solutions that will never actually work. Solar panels, as I described, the most expensive roofing tiles in the world. I have a solar house in southern Mexico, in southern Baja in Mexico, because there's no power there, no grid there. So the only choice is to either have a generator, which makes a pile of noise and also costs a lot of money to run, or to have solar. So we put in solar. 10,000 US dollars produce a maximum 700 watt peak when the sun's shining directly on the panels. For a $20,000 investment in solar panels, you get about $100 to $200 worth of electricity per year, depending on where you are. That's not much of an investment. However, there are very good renewable energy technologies. The two we have already developed, of course, are wood and hydroelectricity. 95% of all the renewable energy in the world is from those two sources. The environmental movement says they're in favor of renewable energy, and yet they're against cutting trees and want to tear all the hydro dams down. What kind of a renewable energy policy is that? There's another form of renewable energy that's a real sleeper and will also be huge in the future, and that is ground source heat pumps. Heat pumps in general, but ground source heat pumps in particular. Geothermal energy, as it's called. You can take electricity from renewable sources like wind and multiply it times 4 in pulling the sun's stored energy out of the surface of the earth and using it to heat, cool, and produce the hot water in your house. 70% of our energy requirements in our domestic homes are for heating, cooling, and hot water. By using ground source heat pumps, we can have 50% of that energy coming from the ground and another 20% coming from renewable electrical sources if they're available in your community. Voluntary population management. There is no doubt that the more people there are, the more mouths there are to feed, the more food we have to produce, the more forest we have to cut down, among other things. There is no scientific answer to how many people there should be. But if we want to have the human population living in a dignified manner with health care and clean water, maybe we need to think about this. It is gratifying that it looks like the population will level off around 8.3 billion rather than going to the 12 billion that was initially predicted by the UN. But even then, maybe we have to think about going down a little ways if we want to have a sustainable system of humans living in dignity and happiness, and the environment being able to support all of that. But population control is not the right term. Coercive methods of controlling population do not work, and they're not right from a human rights point of view. The UN Conference on Population held in Cairo in 1994 made it very clear that the best way to bring about voluntary management of our population is through the education and empowerment of women. That is the way to go, and look around the world and see it happening. Therefore, the strongest linkage between social and environmental in sustainability policy, or one of them, is that in a sustainable future, there is no place for dictatorships, patriarchal systems, or fundamentalism of the Taliban variety. Sustainability is linked to freedom, education, democracy, and all of the other hallmarks of our democratic and educated system. Develop logically consistent global analysis. I'll give you 2 examples. I've given you the one already, which is use less wood, save the trees. Well, use less wood means use more steel and concrete. Use more steel and concrete means more CO2 emissions. When in fact the best way to close the carbon cycle is to grow more trees and use more wood, not use less of it. This is a logically inconsistent policy framework at the highest global level that has been adopted by the environmental movement around the world, and that's a dysfunctional policy framework, and it results in complete confusion. Secondly, the idea that we should save all the world's remaining forests and go back to organic farming. There is no way that organic farming can produce the same yields as industrial modern farming can produce, using our scientific knowledge. Back to organic farming, lose the rest of the world's forests. It's a trade-off. We could all go back to hoeing our own weeds and put 40% of the population back on the land again, and reduce our population by 2 billion practically overnight if we stopped using the nitrogen that we're extracting from the atmosphere to make urea and ammonia, etc. We could do that, but I ask you, is that really the kind of future that we're looking for here? We need to learn to be better gardeners of this earth. Stewardship, protection of biodiversity, concern for streams and erosion. As you know, Roundup-ready GM crops have resulted in a huge decrease in soil erosion because of the ability to adopt low and no-till agricultural practices, for example. There are a lot of methods we could use. I'm all in favor of organic farming in the sense that I believe that many of the techniques of organic farming are valuable in modern agriculture. But I don't believe that organic farming is being interpreted correctly. Genetic modification is a 100% organic technique. There is no chemicals involved. There is no nuclear involved. Whereas organic farmers are using seeds all the time that have been created through nuclear bombardment, the mutations thereof. Organic farmers also tend to use varieties that have higher levels of natural pesticides in them. Bruce proved it conclusively that natural pesticides are just as carcinogenic at high doses in rats as the chemical or synthetic pesticides we use are. So let's not get confused about the word organic being used as a marketing term, which is fine. It's fair to try and put some sizzle on the steak. But there's also organic being used as a scientific term, which means carbon-based, basically, and genetic modification is 100% carbon-based science. We have to learn to control urban sprawl. Urban sprawl is eating up 750,000 acres of forest a year in the United States, and even a larger amount of farmland, most of which was converted from forest to farmland in the first place. About 2 million acres a year are being covered up with concrete. The only way to stop this is to zone, like Portland and my city of Vancouver have done, where there isn't much flat land, so it's very valuable to keep it for agriculture. You have to draw a line in the ground and say the cement stops here. That forces you to build up and in rather than out. Maybe we don't all want to live in rabbit warrens, but if there's going to be more and more millions of people living on the same area of land, you either take up the forest and farmland with a slurb, or you learn to live in an inner city. And we could do with inner cities being revitalized as well. We need to reverse deforestation in the tropics. Of course, this is all being caused by multinational forestry corporations, right? Wrong. It's being caused by a growing population of hundreds of millions of poor people who need to grow some food to feed their families, so they're cutting down the tropical forest to do it. I've been to Indonesia and Africa and Central and South America and Southeast Asia, and I know why the forests are being lost. They're being lost because people have to eat. And we should recognize that. The way we can help them is to provide them with more intensive agricultural and forestry practices so they don't need to use as much land, and so that they can become better gardeners of the areas they live in too. Well, anyways, that'd be about it. That is my vision of environmentalism for the 21st century, and I'd like to thank you again for inviting me today.